In the summer of 1898, a man forgot his pocket watch on a tennis court. It should have been nothing, a small mistake, an object easily returned. Instead, that watch became the spark for one of the most vicious social wars in European royal history. Because inside the watch was not the face of a princess, it was the face of a servant. And the woman who opened it was not forgiving, not kind, and not powerless. She was Archduchess Isabelle of Croÿ, one of the richest and most feared women in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her response would destroy a marriage, poison an imperial court, help push a future emperor toward assassination, and leave her remembered not as a defender of tradition, but as the villain who helped bring an empire down. This is the story of how a forgotten watch exposed the most dangerous woman in Vienna, the forgotten watch and the royal bomb. Summer of 1898. In Pressburg, on a sweltering tennis court, a small object lay alone on a bench, a gold pocket watch. It sounds ridiculous, a trivial oversight after a few sweaty sets. But if you think it's just another lost and found item, you're wrong. That watch was like a grenade with the pin pulled, and the person who picked it up wasn't the kind of person who would smile, run after it, and say, "You dropped this." No. The person who picked up the watch was Archduchess Isabelle of Croÿ, a powerful, ambitious, and fearsome mistress of the Austro-Hungarian court, a woman whose mere presence could change the atmosphere. Isabelle was born a princess of the Croÿ family, an ancient noble lineage. But she didn't settle for that beautiful noble status. She married straight into a position of power. Her husband was Archduke Friedrich, Duke of Teschen, a man of contradictions. In society, he was the supreme commander of the army. In terms of wealth, he was perhaps the second richest man in the empire after the emperor, owning land, factories, palaces. But in the family, he was a shadow. Everyone in Vienna knew. At the dinner table, in the drawing room, in every decision, Isabelle was the one who ordered. She ran the household like a regiment. Discipline, organization, control. And she had one vital goal: 8 daughters, and the obsession called the crown. Isabelle had 8 daughters, 8 arranged marriages, 8 dowries to be paid for. 8 items had to find their destination. But Isabelle wasn't playing it small. She didn't want a count or a baron. She wanted a crown. She wanted the throne. She wanted the royal robes. And in the late 1890s, Europe's biggest item walked right into her house. It was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, grandson of Emperor Franz Joseph. He was notoriously difficult, grumpy, and picky. But to Isabelle, all those traits didn't matter, because he would be emperor. And if she could secure this marriage, she would become the empress. She would even be the woman who could make all of Vienna bow down. Franz Ferdinand began frequenting Isabelle's estates, Pressburg, hunting trips, tennis matches, visits so frequent that the entire court began to murmur. And what about Isabelle? She immediately calculated Franz Ferdinand wasn't married. Her daughter Maria Christina was of marriageable age. In Isabelle's mind, the contract was signed. All that remained was the announcement. She began treating Franz Ferdinand as if he were her future son-in-law. She pushed Maria Christina into every opportunity to meet him, every party, every conversation. But there was a problem. Maria Christina wasn't the one Franz Ferdinand was interested in, and Franz Ferdinand hardly spoke to her. Isabelle didn't listen, didn't look, didn't believe, because Isabelle only saw what she wanted to see: a crown on her daughter's head. The moment the lid popped open, then came the fateful day. A heated tennis match. Franz Ferdinand finished, changed clothes, and hurried back to Vienna. And he forgot his gold watch on the bench. A servant found it and brought it to Isabelle. This was the moment of destiny Isabelle had been waiting for in 19th century Romanticism. Men often placed miniature portraits of their loved ones inside the watch caseback. Isabelle held the watch. It was heavy, cold, but her hands trembled with excitement. In her mind, the scene was already set. The caseback would open, revealing Maria Christina's face inside. proof to declare engaged. Done. She pressed the latch. The caseback sprang open, and Isabel froze. Because the face inside wasn't Maria Christina, not the princess, not the man she had set her sights on. It was Sophie Chotek. Who was Sophie? Nominally, Sophie was a Countess of Bohemia, a prestigious but impoverished family. And in the Habsburg world, Countess and Grand Duke were almost two different things. Because of poverty, Sophie had to work. She was the lady in waiting. And ironically, she was Isabel's own lady in waiting. To put it bluntly, in Isabel's eyes, Sophie was a well-educated maid. The one who carried her handkerchief, served tea, and stood behind her during ceremonies. And yet, the heir to the throne didn't come because of her daughter. He came because of her maid. That humiliation didn't anger Isabel in the usual way. It made her explode. Isabel declares war. Isabel stormed straight to Sophie's quarters. You can imagine, her face flushed, her screams echoing down the hallway, her watch raised as evidence of her crime. For Isabel, this wasn't a love affair. This was rebellion. It was insolence. It was a subordinate daring to step on the steps Isabel guarded with her claws. Sophie was immediately dismissed. But Isabel didn't just want to dismiss her, she wanted to crush Sophie's honor so that no decent family would ever accept her again. Isabel believed that exposing the affair would shame Franz Ferdinand into withdrawing, and then he would return to doing the right thing with Maria Christina. But she made a fatal mistake. She didn't understand Franz Ferdinand. He was the kind of man who would fight back the more he was pushed. And when he heard that Sophie had been humiliated, Franz Ferdinand didn't apologize. He declared directly to the emperor, "I love Sophie Chotek, and I will not marry anyone else." At that moment, everything changed. Because now, in Isabel's eyes, Sophie was not just a traitor. Sophie became an opponent who, if defeated, would force Isabel to bow before the very person she once considered a servant. And Isabel vowed in her heart, if I cannot prevent this marriage, then I will make her life a living hell. The court goes to war, and Isabel writes the rules. Franz Ferdinand did not respond the way Isabel expected. He did not crawl back in embarrassment. He did not apologize. He did not politely forget Sophie. He did the one thing that turns a private scandal into a public crisis. He made it official. He told Emperor Franz Joseph that he loved Sophie Chotek and that he would marry no one else. In one sentence, the heir to the throne put his personal life on a collision course with the most rigid court system in Europe. For Isabel, this was not just a rejection, it was humiliation with a timer attached. If Franz Ferdinand married Sophie, Sophie would no longer be the servant Isabel could dismiss. She would be the wife of the future emperor. And that meant Isabel would someday be expected to bow to the woman she had just tried to ruin. That possibility was unbearable. Isabel mobilizes the anti-Sophie faction. Isabel moved fast. She had two weapons that mattered more than kindness, more than popularity, more than even truth: rank and money. Her husband, Archduke Friedrich, was both powerful and extraordinarily wealthy. He owned vast properties and industrial assets across the empire. In public, he commanded armies. In private, he followed Isabel. He did not stop her. He funded her. So Isabel built a coalition. She gathered other archduchesses and conservative figures at court. She framed the problem in the language that always worked on old dynasties. This is not romance, she implied. This is contamination. This is not love. This is a threat to the bloodline. This is not a marriage. This is a crack in the foundation of the monarchy. In that world, the argument did not need to be fair. It only needed to sound like protocol. Isabel positioned herself as the defender of tradition and used that image to pull people into her orbit. And once they were inside, she gave them a simple rule. If you are kind to Sophie, you are not welcome in my circle. It sounds petty, but in Vienna, it was social life or exile. Isabel hosted the most desirable salons and parties, the best food, the best guest lists, the best connections. If you wanted access to power, you smiled at Isabel and you learned to look through Sophie as if she were not there. The Emperor and the Protocol Trap. Isabel understood the Emperor. Franz Joseph was old, disciplined, and obsessed with legitimacy. He could be persuaded by one word: tradition. So Isabel pushed for a compromise that was not really a compromise. Let Franz Ferdinand marry Sophie, she argued, but on terms that would punish them forever. This is where the morganatic marriage entered the story. The idea was brutal in its simplicity. Franz Ferdinand could marry for love, but Sophie would not receive full royal status. Their children would not inherit. The marriage would be legally unequal, and everyone would be forced to treat it that way. Isabel pressed for the harshest version of these terms, not because she cared about legal theory, but because she wanted a permanent weapon, a contract that would follow Sophie into every room and place her at the end of every line. The wedding happened in 1900, but it did not feel like a celebration. The emperor did not attend. Many archdukes did not attend. Even Franz Ferdinand's brothers did not attend. Isabel did not attend. The message was loud without words. You are married, but you are not accepted. In Isabel's mind, she had turned the future emperor's wedding into something close to a funeral. A book becomes a torture device. After the wedding, Isabel did not relax. She escalated. She used court protocol the way a skilled person uses law, not to create order, but to cause harm while staying technically correct. She studied the rules, memorized them, and enforced them with cold precision. The cruelty did not need shouting. It could be delivered with seating charts. At dinners, Sophie was placed at the far end of long tables, sometimes 30 or 40 feet away from her husband. Franz Ferdinand would sit among high-ranking family members. Sophie would sit among minor officials and distant figures, physically separated by a sea of silver and porcelain. And, because service followed rank, the insult could become tangible. Food arrived to the highest first. By the time platters reached Sophie, the best portions were gone, the dishes were colder, and sometimes she was ignored entirely. Isabel also weaponized entrances. Court rules dictated who entered first and who had to wait. At receptions and events, Isabel and her allies would form a moving blockade. They would sweep through doorways in a wave of silk and jewels, leaving Sophie behind in the hallway, forced to stand alone until the last person of higher status had passed. Even church was not safe. At Mass, Isabel pressed to keep Sophie out of the imperial box. While Franz Ferdinand knelt with the dynasty, Sophie was pushed into public pews, visible to everyone, separated by velvet and rank. And there was the visual war. Isabel, famous for overwhelming jewelry, set expectations of what an archduchess should look like. Sophie, by virtue of her lower status, was discouraged from wearing royal tier jewelry. In the same room, Isabel looked like a walking monument to power, while Sophie was forced into modesty. Isabel wanted that contrast. It was a statement without a sentence. Why this backfired on Franz Ferdinand. Isabel believed humiliation would break Sophie and force Franz Ferdinand to reconsider. Instead, every insult did two things. It made Franz Ferdinand love Sophie more, and it made him hate Isabel more. The court split into camps. There was Franz Ferdinand's circle, increasingly separate and defensive. And there was the court clique organized around Isabel, enforcing the unwritten rule that Sophie was untouchable. Franz Ferdinand began to keep mental notes of who participated, who snubbed, who turned away. He spoke openly about how things would change when he had power. He imagined a future purge of the people who had treated his wife as a stain. Meanwhile, Isabel was gambling on one thing, that the old emperor would live forever. As long as Franz Joseph ruled, Isabel could maintain the system that kept Sophie down. But every year that passed pushed the empire closer to the moment when Franz Ferdinand would inherit authority. And if that day came, Isabel knew the math. Sophie would rise. Isabel would fall. That fear kept her relentless. The Kaiser steps in, and Isabel loses control. For years, Isabel believed her power was absolute. Inside Vienna, inside the Habsburg court, she set the tone. She decided who mattered and who did not. Sophie Chotek was supposed to remain invisible, frozen at the bottom of the hierarchy. But Isabel made one fatal mistake. She assumed the world ended at the borders of Austria-Hungary It did not. The German Kaiser seized an opportunity. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was many things: loud, impulsive, obsessed with rank and spectacle. But he was not stupid. He understood that the future of the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary rested on one man, Franz Ferdinand. And Wilhelm quickly noticed something others pretended not to see. The Austrian court was humiliating the future emperor by humiliating his wife. Where Isabel saw protocol, Wilhelm saw leverage. So the Kaiser made a decision that would shake the Viennese court to its core. He decided to treat Sophie not as a problem, but as a queen. Berlin breaks the rules. When Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were invited to Germany, panic spread in Vienna. Would the Germans follow Austrian protocol? Would Sophie be sidelined again? Isabel likely expected Berlin to obey the old rules. Instead, Wilhelm tore them apart. At state banquets in Berlin, Sophie was not sent to the end of the table. She was seated next to the Kaiser himself. He offered her his arm. He toasted her publicly. He treated her with full royal honor. News of this traveled back to Vienna instantly. The effect was devastating. The most powerful monarch in Europe had just declared, without saying it aloud, that Sophie mattered. And by extension, that the Austrian court was behaving like a petty provincial clique. The humiliation of Isabel. For Isabel, this was more than an insult. It was exposure. She had spent years insisting that Sophie was unworthy. Now the German emperor was openly contradicting her. Worse, Wilhelm did not seek Isabel's approval. He did not visit her palace. He did not flatter her. He went directly to Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. It was the ultimate social rejection. Every photograph of Sophie beside the Kaiser weakened Isabel's authority. Foreign diplomats began to question Vienna. If Germany treats her like royalty, why should we treat her like a servant? Isabel's carefully constructed blockade began to crack. Franz Ferdinand finds his backbone. For Franz Ferdinand, the Kaiser's support was transformative. For years, he had been isolated, mocked, and sidelined. Now, one of the most powerful men in the world validated his marriage. It strengthened his resolve. It deepened his loyalty to Sophie, and it hardened his hatred for Isabel. He began to speak more openly about reform, not just of court etiquette, but of the empire itself. He imagined a future where these petty hierarchies would be dismantled. Isabel noticed the shift, and it terrified her. Isabel strikes back with gossip. When rules stopped working, Isabel turned to rumors. She whispered that Sophie was a German agent, that her closeness to the Kaiser was suspicious, that Franz Ferdinand was being manipulated. The accusations were thin, but they poisoned the atmosphere. They turned success into suspicion. They framed dignity as treason. It was a desperate move, and it revealed something important. Isabel was losing control. Why this moment mattered. From this point forward, the conflict was no longer just personal. It was political. It was international. Sophie was no longer isolated. Franz Ferdinand was no longer alone. And Isabel was no longer untouchable. Inside Vienna, she still held power. But outside, the world had begun to move past her. And that shift would push Franz Ferdinand further away from the capital, further away from safety, and closer to a decision that would change history. Vienna becomes a prison and the road to Sarajevo. By the early 1910 seconds, Vienna was no longer a home for Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. It was a battlefield. Every invitation carried a risk. Every public appearance was a test. Every doorway, every table, every procession could be turned into an instrument of humiliation. And at the center of it all was Isabel, a capital turned hostile. Isabel did not need to shout anymore. Her system was fully operational. Sophie knew that if Isabel was present at an event, something would happen. A delayed entrance, a missing chair, a seat placed far from her husband, a sudden silence as she approached. Vienna became a city of traps. Franz Ferdinand had to calculate every movement. Is Isabel attending? What rule will she enforce this time? This constant tension wore him down. Already prone to illness and explosive moods, he grew more bitter and isolated. He stopped trusting the court. He stopped trusting the capital. and slowly he began to look for ways out. Escape from Vienna. Franz Ferdinand created distance. He retreated to his estate at Konopiste. He built a private world around Sophie and their children. It was quieter, kinder, human, but it was also political exile. By removing himself from Vienna, Franz Ferdinand lost daily influence. His proposals were easier to ignore. His warnings were easier to dismiss. Isabelle did not see this as a problem. She saw it as a victory. Why Sophie went to Sarajevo. Here is the detail that breaks the heart. Sophie was rarely allowed to appear beside her husband in public. Court protocol forbade it on official state occasions. But the military inspection trip to Sarajevo in 1914 was different. Franz Ferdinand was traveling as Inspector General of the Army, not as heir to the throne. That meant the rules did not apply. For once, Sophie could ride in the car beside her husband, not behind, not apart, beside him. She went to Sarajevo for one reason: to be a wife. Isabelle and the unseen hand. Isabelle did not pull the trigger. Gavrilo Princip did. But Isabelle had helped shape the path. Her relentless cruelty had made Vienna unbearable. Her social war had pushed Franz Ferdinand away from the capital. Her obsession with protocol had turned escape into necessity. Franz Ferdinand accepted the Sarajevo visit because it offered dignity, normality, a brief life outside Isabelle's shadow. And that decision placed him and Sophie in the open, unprotected, and exposed. The bitter irony. Sophie died because she was finally allowed to sit beside her husband. The only place she was permitted to be treated as an equal was also the place where the bullets found her. Isabelle had wanted Sophie erased from history. Instead, she helped place her at its center. Death does not end the war. The shots in Sarajevo ended 2 lives, but they did not end Isabelle's campaign. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek lay dead, and Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. Empires trembled, diplomats panicked. The world began to slide toward war. But inside the Albertina Palace in Vienna, Isabelle of Croÿ did not collapse in grief. She calculated the problem is solved. There is no record of Isabelle mourning Sophie, no letters of sorrow, no public expressions of regret. For Isabelle, the woman she had fought for 15 years was gone. The rival was removed. The threat to her social dominance was finished. In her mind, the problem had been solved by fate, if not by her own hand. What remained was to ensure that Sophie was not elevated by death, a funeral designed to humiliate. In the Habsburg world, funerals were political statements. Rank mattered even in death. Isabelle intervened immediately. She argued that Sophie, because of her morganatic status, must not receive full honors. Her coffin must not be placed on the same level as Franz Ferdinand's. She must not be mourned as an equal wife. And so the funeral became an insult. It was rushed. It was quiet. It was stripped of imperial grandeur. Even in death, Sophie was pushed aside. Isabelle had won the last social battle, or so she believed. War changes the balance of power. World War I did not strengthen the old order. It exposed its rot. Isabelle's husband, Archduke Friedrich, was appointed supreme commander of the Austro-Hungarian army. In practice, he was a figurehead. In reality, Isabelle followed him to headquarters and recreated her court in wartime. While soldiers froze and starved, Isabelle hosted lavish dinners. While cities rationed bread, she displayed wealth. While men died in trenches, she enforced protocol. The contrast was obscene. From court queen to symbol of corruption, Isabelle became a symbol, not of dignity, but of everything people hated about the old aristocracy. Rumors spread that her estates profited from army contracts, that her influence decided promotions. That war was a business opportunity for her household. Whether exaggerated or not, the perception was fatal. She was no longer feared. She was resented. The fall comes quietly. In 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph died. The throne passed to Emperor Karl. Karl was young. He was serious. And he saw Isabelle clearly. He removed Friedrich from command, and with that single decision, Isabelle lost her power base. For the first time in decades, she was told no. The court dissolved. The war dragged on. The empire weakened. And Isabel, once untouchable, began to fade. The empire collapses, and Isabel is left with nothing but herself. The world Isabel had dominated for decades did not fall all at once. It unraveled. Titles lost their meaning. Protocol lost its teeth. And money, the force that had bent so many people to her will, began to slip through her fingers. The end of the old emperor and the end of protection. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, an era ended. He had been the immovable pillar that held the old court together, and he had been the shield that protected Isabel. His successor, Emperor Karl, was young and deeply uncomfortable with the corruption and spectacle surrounding the war. He saw the headquarters at Teschen for what it was. Not a command center, but a private court built on suffering. Karl acted quickly. Archduke Friedrich was removed from his post. With him went Isabel's informal authority. No more access. No more whispered influence. No more fear. For the first time in her life, Isabel was irrelevant. The war turns against her. As the war dragged on, resentment hardened into rage. Food shortages spread. Soldiers mutinied. Civilians starved. And the image of Isabel, surrounded by luxury while the empire bled, became intolerable. She had once been the center of gravity in Vienna. Now she was a symbol of everything people wanted gone. The aristocracy that once bowed to her began to distance themselves. Silence replaced flattery. Absence replaced loyalty. The empire dissolves. In 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. Borders vanished. New nations emerged. The legal foundations of Isabel's power evaporated overnight. Nobility was abolished. Titles were outlawed. The word archduchess no longer had legal meaning. The woman who had once ruled doorways and dining rooms became, on paper, an ordinary citizen. The fortune is taken apart. The greatest blow was not social. It was financial. The Teschen estates lay in territories that became Poland and Czechoslovakia. The new governments viewed the Habsburgs as occupiers. They seized land. They nationalized factories. They dismantled the industrial empire that had fueled Isabel's dominance. The Albertina Palace was taken by the state. The art collections became public property. The palace where Isabel had orchestrated exclusion became a museum open to everyone, belonging to no one. She was not left destitute. She had hidden wealth, jewels, cash, but the endless river of power was gone. Exile without an audience. Isabel and Friedrich left Vienna, not in triumph, not in dignity. They retreated to their remaining properties, cut off from the city that once feared them. There were no salons, no guest lists, no court, only silence. Isabel had spent her life shaping how others were seen. Now, no one was watching the final reckoning and what history remembered. Isabelle of Croÿ survived the world she helped destroy. That is the final irony of her story. She outlived the court that feared her, the empire that empowered her, and the rules she once enforced with ruthless precision. When the noise faded and the titles vanished, what remained was not a queen of society, but an old woman alone with her choices. A long life without power. After the fall of the empire, Isabel lived quietly. There were no balls, no salons, no rivals to crush. The young republic had no interest in her. The new generation did not fear her name. To them, she was a relic of a cruel and outdated world. Her husband, Archduke Friedrich, died in 1936. With him went the last illusion of shared authority. Isabel lived on, increasingly bitter, increasingly irrelevant. She had spent her life fighting to keep Sophie Chotek from becoming empress. In a narrow sense, she succeeded. But in doing so, she helped destroy the throne itself. The children she tried to erase. The greatest failure of Isabel's campaign was this. Sophie did not disappear. Her children lived. They suffered exile, persecution, and later imprisonment under the Nazi regime. But they survived with their dignity intact. History remembers them as victims of cruelty, not as stains on a bloodline. Isabel, by contrast, is remembered as a caricature of aristocratic decay. the judgment of history. When historians look back at the fall of the Habsburg Empire, Isabel appears not as a footnote, but as a symptom. She embodied a system that valued rank over humanity, rules over compassion, exclusion over survival. She defended tradition so fiercely that she helped break it. Sophie and the Measure of Worth. Sophie Chotek died young. She died violently, but she died loved. She was killed holding the hand of a man who chose her over crowns, money, and obedience. That is not a small legacy. Isabel died in comfort but without honor, surrounded by memories of power that no longer mattered. One woman is remembered for kindness and loyalty, the other for cruelty and fear. The final question. Isabel believed that rules made her strong. In reality, they revealed her insecurity. She feared that love without strategy could triumph, that warmth could defeat calculation, that a servant could be happier than a princess. And that fear drove everything she did. This is why Isabelle of Croÿ is remembered not as a guardian of tradition, but as one of the great villains of European court history. Not because she broke the rules, but because she followed them without mercy